In the year 1500, an observer standing at the crossroads of the world would have seen little reason to bet on Europe. Ming China commanded fleets larger than anything Lisbon or London could imagine. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, its armies feared from Vienna to the Persian Gulf. The Mughal court in India overflowed with wealth that dwarfed most European treasuries. And yet, within 3 centuries, a handful of small European states would remake the entire planet in their image, colonizing continents, dictating trade, and igniting an economic transformation so total that historians still argue over its true cause. Why did some nations rise while others, once equal or greater in power, fell behind? Why did a foggy island off the coast of Europe outproduce empires 10 times its size? Why did Japan rebuild from atomic ash into an economic superpower in a single generation, while nations rich in resources remain trapped in poverty for centuries? This is not a story of destiny. It is a story of choices, institutions, geography, timing, and the razor-thin margins that separate stagnation from takeoff. Some of the answers will surprise you. Some remain bitterly disputed among historians and economists to this day. We will not reveal how the story ends. But by the time it does, you will never look at a map of the world the same way again. For most of human history, the gap between nations was measured in inches, not miles. In the year 1000, a farmer in Song dynasty China lived, in material terms, roughly as well as a farmer in France, and considerably better than one in England. Historians who study long-run economic data, such as Angus Madison's estimates of historical GDP, generally agree that income differences between the great agrarian civilizations of Eurasia were modest until surprisingly late, the 16th, and in many respects the 18th, century. China's Song and Ming dynasties possessed sophisticated bureaucracies, advanced metallurgy, movable type printing centuries before Gutenberg, and a canal and road network that outclassed anything in Europe. The Islamic world, from Baghdad's House of Wisdom to Ottoman Istanbul, had preserved and expanded classical learning while much of Europe was fragmented into feuding kingdoms. India's Mughal Empire under rulers like Akbar commanded a treasury so vast that European visitors described it in disbelief. So why did the Great Divergence, the term economic historian Kenneth Pomerantz popularized to describe the moment European incomes pulled sharply ahead of the rest of the world, happen where and when it did? The debate among historians breaks along several major lines of argument, and a responsible telling must hold them all in tension rather than pretend one explanation settles the matter. The first argument is geographic. Jared Diamond's influential thesis holds that the very shape of continents mattered. Eurasia's east-west axis allowed crops, livestock, and technologies to spread across similar latitudes, while Africa's north-south axis and the Americas' narrow geography slowed the diffusion of innovation. Europe additionally possessed a jagged coastline rich in natural harbors, numerous navigable rivers, and a temperate climate suited to intensive agriculture, advantages that, cumulatively, lowered the cost of trade and communication compared to more isolated or climatically harsh regions. Critics counter that geography alone cannot explain why China, blessed with the Yangtze and Yellow rivers and enormous fertile plains, did not industrialize first, or why parts of Europe with poor geography still thrived. This leads to the second, and perhaps most contested, argument: institutions. Economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson have argued that the decisive difference lay not in soil or climate but in the rules societies built, property rights, checks on rulers, and incentives for ordinary people to invest and innovate. England's Glorious Revolution of 1688 constrained the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament's control over taxation, giving merchants and inventors confidence that profits would not be arbitrarily seized by the crown. Contrast this with the more centralized, extractive systems that historians describe in Ming and Qing China, where a powerful imperial bureaucracy could, and periodically did, restrict private commerce, foreign trade, and even certain technologies, as when the Ming court famously dismantled its own treasure fleet under the Yongle Emperor's successors and turned inward after the 1430s, ending the voyages of Admiral Zheng He at precisely the moment European states were turning outward. Whether this reversal was driven primarily by court politics, Confucian bureaucratic caution, or fiscal pressures remains debated among historians, but its consequence is not. China possessed the largest ships on earth and chose to stop building them, just decades before Portuguese caravels began creeping down the African coast. The Ottoman Empire followed a related but distinct path. Its early modern strength rested on an efficient military administrative system, the Devshirme recruitment of the Janissary Corps, and control of lucrative trade routes linking Europe and Asia. Yet many historians argue that the empire's later stagnation stemmed from a combination of factors: the loss of trade route monopolies once European ships began sailing directly to Asia around Africa, internal resistance to certain technologies and institutional reforms, and a scale of bureaucratic and military conservatism that made rapid adaptation difficult. It would be inaccurate to say the Ottomans rejected technology broadly. They adopted gunpowder weapons early and effectively, but structural and political factors slowed the kind of self-sustaining commercial and industrial transformation that took hold in parts of Europe. A third argument centers on the printing press and the diffusion of knowledge. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type press, developed in Mainz around 1440, spread across Europe with extraordinary speed, in part because Europe's political fragmentation meant no single authority could suppress it everywhere at once. If one prince banned a book, a printer simply moved to a rival's territory. Within decades, printed material multiplied literacy, scientific exchange, and the circulation of Reformation ideas that would themselves reshape European institutions. China had movable type far earlier, but its character-based writing system, with thousands of unique glyphs, made the technology less transformative than in alphabetic Europe, while centralized control over publishing in some periods limited its disruptive potential. The fourth argument is colonial and commercial. The so-called Age of Exploration, launched by Portugal and Spain in the 15th century and expanded by the Dutch, French, and English in the centuries following, funneled enormous wealth: silver from Potosi, sugar from the Caribbean, and later cotton from the American South, into European economies. Historians debate how central this extracted wealth was to Europe's eventual industrial takeoff. Some, like Pomerantz, argue that access to New World resources and the ghost acres they represented were essential in allowing Europe, and especially Britain, to escape the ecological constraints that were beginning to limit growth in East Asia. Others argue that domestic institutional and technological factors were more decisive, and that colonial wealth, while significant, was not by itself sufficient to explain industrialization. What is not disputed is the moral cost. This wealth was extracted through the transatlantic slave trade and the violent subjugation of colonized peoples, a history whose consequences, including the deliberate underdevelopment of many colonized regions, still shape global inequality today. All of these threads converge in 18th-century Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began. Britain possessed several advantages simultaneously: accessible coal deposits located conveniently near iron ore and water transport, a relatively stable constitutional system that protected patents and property, a large integrated domestic market free of internal tariffs, a growing colonial and trade network supplying raw cotton and captive markets, and a culture that, for a variety of institutional and religious reasons, including the practical, tinkering ethos encouraged in certain Protestant and dissenter communities, prized mechanical experimentation. James Watt's improved steam engine, patented in 1769, transformed mine drainage and then, decades later, transportation and manufacturing broadly. The spinning jenny, the power loom, and the factory system reorganized production around machines and wage labor rather than household craft. Britain did not invent every component of this transformation, but it was the first place where these elements combined into a self-reinforcing cycle. Cheaper energy lowered the cost of manufacturing, manufacturing profits funded further mechanization, and mechanization created demand for coal, iron, and engineering skill in a spiral historians call the takeoff. The consequences rippled outward unevenly. Continental European powers, France, the German states, Belgium, industrialized within decades of Britain, adapting British technology while building their own institutional variations, often with greater direct state involvement in banking and infrastructure than Britain's more market-driven model. Germany's unification in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck coincided with rapid industrial growth in the Ruhr Valley, where coal and steel production soon rivaled and then exceeded Britain's, aided by a state-coordinated education and technical training system that produced engineers and scientists at scale. Farther east, Japan offers perhaps history's most striking example of deliberate, compressed national transformation. Until 1853, Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate maintained a policy of near-total isolation from the West. The arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry's warships that year, demanding the opening of Japanese ports, exposed the military and technological gap between Japan and the industrializing West in humiliating terms. Rather than collapse into colonial subjugation as much of Asia had, Japan's ruling elites responded with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, a sweeping program of top-down modernization. The new Meiji government abolished the feudal domain system, sent officials abroad to study Western law, education, and industry, imported foreign engineers and advisors, built railways and telegraph lines, and established a national conscript army and modern banking system, all within roughly a generation. By 1905, Japan had defeated Russia, a European great power, in the Russo-Japanese War, a result that stunned observers worldwide and demonstrated that non-Western nations could master industrial military power on their own terms, provided institutions were deliberately and rapidly reformed. The 20th century then delivered the most dramatic reversals of national fortune in recorded history, born from catastrophe. Germany and Japan, having pursued militarist expansion that led to their near-total destruction in the Second World War, emerged from 1945 as bombed-out, occupied, impoverished states. Yet within 25 years, both had become among the wealthiest economies on earth, a transformation historians and economists refer to, respectively, as the Wirtschaftswunder and the Japanese post-war economic miracle. Several factors converged: American Reconstruction aid through the Marshall Plan and, in Japan's case, American occupation-era reforms, currency reform and market-oriented policies, notably Ludwig Erhardt's 1948 reforms in West Germany, a highly educated, disciplined workforce and existing industrial know-how that had merely been physically destroyed rather than lost. Cold War geopolitics that made Western powers eager to rebuild both nations as bulwarks against communism, and, crucially, institutions of stable property rights, independent central banking, and export-oriented industrial policy that channeled these advantages into sustained growth. A similar, even more compressed transformation unfolded in South Korea. In 1953, after the devastation of the Korean War, South Korea was among the poorest countries on earth, its income per capita comparable to some of the least developed nations in Africa at the time. Under the authoritarian but development-focused government of Park Chung-hee beginning in 1961, South Korea pursued export-led industrialization, channeling credit and state support toward manufacturing conglomerates, the chaebol, including Samsung and Hyundai, while investing heavily in universal education. Within a single working lifetime, South Korea transformed from an aid recipient into a global manufacturing and technology powerhouse, a trajectory historians and economists frequently compare to Taiwan and Singapore, which followed related though distinct paths combining state-guided investment, export orientation, and heavy emphasis on education and infrastructure. Singapore in particular, under Lee Kuan Yew, leveraged its strategic port location, built rigorously meritocratic and low-corruption institutions, and pursued foreign investment aggressively, rising from a small, resource-poor city-state to one of the world's wealthiest nations per capita. Not every region shared in this compressed catch-up. Much of Latin America, despite gaining independence from Spain and Portugal in the early 19th century, a full century before most of Asia and Africa achieved independence from European colonizers, experienced repeated cycles of political instability, military coups, debt crises, and commodity dependence that many economic historians argue delayed sustained industrial diversification, even where natural resources were abundant. Sub-Saharan Africa's post-colonial trajectory has been shaped by a further layer of complexity. Borders drawn by colonial powers with little regard for existing ethnic and political communities, the legacy of extractive rather than developmental colonial institutions, Cold War-era proxy conflicts, and, in many though not all cases, continued struggles with governance and infrastructure. Economists and historians disagree sharply on how much weight to assign to colonial legacy versus post-independence governance choices versus geography and disease burden, including the historical impact of malaria and other tropical diseases on agricultural productivity, and no single explanation commands universal acceptance among specialists. The Middle East's modern trajectory adds still another layer. Some oil-rich states achieved enormous wealth without following the industrial and educational transformation seen in East Asia, a pattern economists sometimes describe using the concept of the resource curse, the observation that abundant natural resource wealth can, under certain institutional conditions, discourage the broader economic diversification and institutional development that sustained growth typically requires, though this concept, too, remains debated and does not apply uniformly across resource-rich nations. What emerges from comparing these cases is not a single formula but a recurring pattern of necessary, though not individually sufficient, ingredients, stable and credible institutions that protect property and contracts, investment in mass education, often the single strongest predictor economists identify for long-run growth, openness to trade and technology transfer, whether through voluntary adoption as in Meiji Japan or forced opening as with Perry's ships, a functioning state capable of building infrastructure and enforcing law without becoming so extractive that it smothers private initiative, and, frequently, a specific historical window, a crisis, a defeat, an opening, that concentrates political will behind reform in a way ordinary times rarely produce. Britain's Glorious Revolution, Japan's Meiji Restoration, Germany's post-war reconstruction, and Korea's post-war transformation each followed a shock that broke the hold of old arrangements and created space for new institutions to take root. None of this determinism is comfortable. It suggests that national fortune is neither wholly a matter of culture, nor of resources, nor of race or climate, explanations that have, at various points in history, been deployed to justify colonial domination and remain thoroughly discredited by the actual comparative evidence. Nations that were once dismissed by European observers as incapable of modern development, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and now increasingly China itself, since its own post-1978 reforms under Deng Xiaoping opened its economy to market mechanisms and foreign investment, have repeatedly demonstrated that rapid transformation is possible when institutions, education, and openness align, regardless of geography or starting point. The story of why some nations rise faster than others is, in the end, a story about the fragility and reversibility of power itself. Ming China once possessed the largest fleet on earth and chose to burn it. The Ottoman Empire once stood at the center of world trade and slowly found itself at its periphery. Britain, a damp island with little in the way of natural abundance beyond coal and iron, remade the modern world through institutions, timing, and machinery. And in the 20th century, nations flattened by war rebuilt themselves into the wealthiest societies in human history within a single lifetime. There is, perhaps, a final and uncomfortable lesson embedded in this history: no rise is permanent, and no fall is final. The same institutional fragility that allowed England to overtake Ming China can just as easily allow today's leading nations to be overtaken tomorrow. The forces that lifted South Korea from poverty in a single generation remain, in principle, available to any nation willing and able to build the institutions that channel them. Whether any given nation seizes that opportunity, or squanders it, as so many empires have before, remains, as it always has, a matter of choices made by people, not a verdict written into geography or blood.